So it gives me considerable pleasure to welcome today Professor Astrid Ogilvie to present the 2020 Herman Paulson Lecture. Before I do introduce you more formally, Astrid, I would just like to give a little bit of background to the Paulson Lectures, which I think is appropriate on this special event. I'd like to include information about in memory and in celebration of a scholar whose name is familiar to those in the same specialist field of Icelandic saga studies, but also to those with an interest in that body of work, but who lack the language facility to study the original texts. And I do include myself in that group and confirm that my copy of Akureyri Saga, translated by Pálsson and Edwards in 1978, still remains my go-to text. So Herman Paulson was a stalwart of the Society. He was a founding father, in fact, one of the first committee members from 1968 to 82, and he was president in 1970 to 71. He was born in Northern Iceland in 1921, and following a Cand.Mag degree in Icelandic studies at the University of Iceland in 1947, he sought to follow this up with a BA degree in Irish Studies at the National University of Ireland in Dublin in 1950. This lucky juxtaposition of both Norse and Celtic study was to shape some of his early works and all of his outlook. And following his appointment to a lectureship in Icelandic Studies in the Department of English Language at Edinburgh University, he set about creating a centre of excellence and a home from home for many passing Icelandic students and scholars alike, often meeting at the home of the Icelandic Consul General in Edinburgh, the father of Magnus Magnusson. With his wife, Gudrun, Stella as we call her, they created a formidable team, nurturing transient students and so much more besides. Through a lifetime of saga translations and international lectures, he was determined to enhance the standing of Norse studies in Britain and organising the first international saga conference in Edinburgh in 1971. In 1982, he was awarded a personal chair at Edinburgh. His friendship and academic meanderings with Magnus were delightfully laid out in Northern Studies, volume 39, and in that source, we see a measure of Herman, the man, and the scholar. An appreciation in Northern Studies 37 by Arne Kruse paints a warm and deeply respectful image of Paulson, noting that even on retirement in 1988, there was much to bring to completion. His death in 2002 left so many feeling bereft, not just for his scholarship, but for his role as mentor and family man, an Icelander to the core, despite having lived across the waters for so long. Magnusson described this man as a magical wordsmith, a poet of no mean ability, alongside his role as a scholar and a teacher. If a nation's treasure lies in its scholars, as Magnusson reminds us, and we need reminding now more than ever, then there can be no greater representative for us to celebrate today. And as we turn to our Herman Paulson lecturer for 2020, Professor Astrid Ogilvie, we have in a wonderful, wonderful exponent of the discipline. So Astrid is a climate historian and a human ecologist, and she has a biography, CV, which I haven't even got time to read. It's very, very impressive. Her abiding interest is in both the broader issues of climatic change and the environmental humanities. Her overarching career goal has always been to build bridges between arts, humanities, and the natural sciences in order to foster interdisciplinary cross-fertilization. Her current research interests focus primarily on climatic and social ecological changes in Arctic coastal communities. However, she's also interested in the more serious topic of the creation of weather by magical means. Her extensive CV includes leadership of 12 interdisciplinary international research projects funded by the NSF in the US and participation in 5 others. There are further awards from the Research Council of Iceland, the Leverhulme Trust, and 2 Nordforsk Centre for Excellence Awards. She currently leads the Nordic Centre of Excellence Nordforsk-funded Arctic Climate Predictions, Pathways to Resilient, Sustainable Societies. And in addition to a project, The Natural World in Literary and Historical Sources from Iceland, AD 800 to 1800. Her teaching activities included being invited by the anthropology department at the University of Colorado to design and teach a new undergraduate course, which she entitled The North Atlantic Peoples and Cultures. The focus was on history and literature, anthropology and environment of Iceland, Greenland and Labrador. And she currently sits on several PhD committees. She has many, many awards, which I am unable to list here due to time, which included a Fulbright scholarship to Iceland. And she has extensive authorship of over 100 scientific papers and edited books. She recently joint authored an article which was awarded the 2019 St Andrews Article Prize in European Environmental History, which is of course a feather in her cap. She's a senior scientist at the Stefansson Arctic Institute in Akureyri, Iceland, a fellow of the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, an associated faculty in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Colorado, as well as an adjunct professor at Hunter College. Oh, I've run out of breath. She is indeed also a visiting professor at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Orkney. She's a founder member of the North Atlantic Biocultural Organization, NABO, and the inaugural meeting at Bowdoin College, Maine, I think it must have been in the late 1970s or early 80s, was where our paths first crossed. And since that time, we've coincided in New York, in Newfoundland, Nevat and Kirkwall, amongst other diverse locations. And we are now clearly on the same lecture rota, as Zoom permits much broader access. So I'll see you elsewhere. So Astrid, it gives me considerable pleasure to ask you to present the 2020 Herman Paulson Memorial Lecture with the title, Weather as Magic and Metaphor in the Saga of Icelanders. Take it away, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all those kind words, and it's so delightful to be introduced by Colleen Beatty. Colleen, I count you a very good friend and colleague, even though we only managed to meet every 20 years or so, but we do it in wonderful places. I'm going to hit the thing that says share screen, and let's see. Okay. Share. Okay. Now, if I do presenter view, can you all see this?
That's perfect.
It is? Oh, good. Well, thank you again, Colleen. And thanks are also due to Richard Oram and the Scottish Society for Northern Studies for doing me the honour of inviting me to give the Herman Paulson Memorial Lecture this year. And special thanks to Ian Giles for his organisation and all his cheery messages. So I'd like to, it was lovely to have that introduction about Herman Paulson, who we all owe such a debt of gratitude to. And I felt it was appropriate for me just to begin with him too. And so we're quite well established that he was one of the most distinguished scholars of Icelandic studies of his generation. And we know he often worked with Magnus Magnusson and Paul Edwards. Perhaps you know, a focal point of his work was his work kind of not just on Icelandic literature, but it's, in a sense, its relationship to European humanism. And of course, he translated around 40 works of medieval Icelandic literature. And this is a quotation from an obituary in The Scotsman. He showed that the sagas were not, as many earlier scholars had claimed, a uniquely indigenous flowering of native genius sprouting from the virgin soil of Iceland, but had benefited immensely from influences from abroad. So I was very lucky to meet Herman a few times, mainly at Viking Society events. And I'd also like to mention my own particular debt of gratitude to him, because when I'm wearing a rather different hat, I work on reconstructing the past climate of Iceland based on documentary evidence. So trying to establish scientific facts rather than magical means of constructing the weather. So as I say, for me, particularly important has been his work on the medieval Icelandic Annals, because they're collectively one of the most important sources of climate information in Iceland from the late 12th century to about 1430. And there are around 11 of them. They're not independent works, but they do give some very good information about the climate. And Herman Paulson worked a lot on the Annals, and I really appreciated reading his scholarship and conclusions. So I've got another debt of gratitude, and that's my collaboration with Professor Gisli Pálsson. And we wrote this paper together a few years ago, and I have to honestly say it was Gisli who first started me thinking about the weather magic in the sagas, and he'd been thinking about it for a while, and so we wrote this paper together and still collaborate on all sorts of different things. So clearly the wish to control the weather is a deep-seated human desire. And I think in countries where the weather is capricious and frequently cold, wet and stormy, it's not surprising that supposed magical control of the weather was elevated to a high art. So in Scandinavia in general, the use of weather magic is relatively well known. So the importance of climate and weather in daily life is reflected in numerous historical and literary genres. And the Sagas of Icelanders are no exception. They include many references to weather events and climatic conditions, and some may reflect reality. But more frequently, weather descriptions appear to be used as a literary device, as a metaphor, or to create a mood. And there are also numerous references to the control of weather by sorcery. So this is where we're going, a little bit of context, a little bit of talk about the Sagas of Icelanders, a little bit of environmental context, and some thoughts on belief systems. And then we'll go to conjuring the weather, mainly through looking at some individual sagas. And then we'll just think a little bit about weather when it's used as a metaphor. And then we'll have a summary and some more acknowledgements. So I know I'm speaking to the converted here. We all know all these things, but just to give us this little bit of background context. So Iceland was settled from around AD 870 onwards. Historical writing began in the 1100s. 1262, Iceland becomes part of Norway, and the golden age of saga writing was in the 13th and 14th centuries. And from that time onwards, great emphasis has been placed on the written word and the power of the word and all that that implies. So a little bit of the environmental and climatic context, because obviously when we're thinking about weather, even if it's magical, it is constrained by what's going on in the natural world. And I think maybe you can see my pointer, but the climate of Iceland is so variable because it's affected by these warmer ocean currents and warmer air currents coming from the south, and then the colder ocean and air currents from the north. And then of course the sea ice that drifted down from the East Greenland current down to the shores of Iceland. Not so much these days, of course. So it's a land of ice with the sea ice and the glaciers and fire, because it's a volcanic island, and volcanic eruptions occur on average every 5 years. some big, some small. So there are all sorts of saga genres, as you know, but what we're going to talk about today is just the Sagas of Icelanders. They used to be called more frequently the family sagas, but nowadays it seems that the Sagas of Icelanders is the correct term. They were written in 13th and 14th century Iceland, and they mainly describe events that took place in the 10th and 11th centuries. There are around 40 sagas, the longer sagas. So the contemporary perspective of the time, in 13th century Iceland, the sagas were regarded as works with historical value. But in the 14th century, the sagas were increasingly fictionalized, and the audience was most likely aware of that. We can't be absolutely sure, of course. And they provided stories about the heathen ancestors based on oral tradition. The sagas were also valued as entertainment, and they could be read aloud. So, as we know, in the year 1000, possibly 999, Christianity was accepted in Iceland, and this is a very important date when we're considering the history of Iceland. So, but before AD 1000, what were the beliefs of Icelanders? Well, the short answer is we don't know. We can't say precisely. Probably around the time of the change, there was a mixture of beliefs. Helgi Magri, for example, Helgi the Lean, one of the first settlers to northern Iceland, he's said to have believed in Christ, but hedged his bets by trusting to Thor during sea voyages. Very wise. And this is a little passage from the saga of Grettir the Strong, a very interesting account. It says, although Christianity had been accepted in Iceland, many vestiges of heathendom remained. It had been the law in Iceland that sacrifices and other black magic were not forbidden if they were practiced in private, but were punishable by lesser outlawry if they were done publicly. So I think also the sense of duality that we get, it's reflected in characters like Sæmundur Sigfusson the Wise, who was an early Icelandic historian, but in Icelandic folklore, he's regarded as having dabbled in the black arts. He studied abroad. I think I've always read France, but the other day I was reading something and it said it may well have been Franconia, actually, where he studied. Anyway, but Icelandic sources from around that time talk about him as having dabbled in the black arts. So what do we know? What more do we know about pre-Christian religion? The concepts clearly so very different to our own. Religion clearly wasn't a separate thing. It was part of daily life. I think that much we can say. And just to mention also dear Snorri Sturluson, because so much of what we know about Norse mythology and early beliefs come from his works, particularly the Prose Edda, or Younger Edda as it's sometimes called. And of course, he was writing long after Christianity had been accepted, so what he was writing was very much colored by current beliefs. So I have here, I think, a very, very nice quote from my colleague Vidar Hreinsson, who's the general editor of the Sagas of Icelanders recent translation. He says, regarding belief systems, when we were talking once, and I made sure to write it down, he says, first of all, we have to be aware of the ontological chronological differences. Perceptions of life, death, and other worlds were different. It was as if there was a kind of semi-open passage between different spheres of existence. I don't think modern people can grasp the entire variety of the beings that existed. So we know there were trolls, there were giants, there were elves, there were ghosts, there were sorcerers, there were shapeshifters, and there were witches. So the Sagas of Icelanders, they have many references to supernatural beings and events, some more than others, but obviously here we're focusing mainly on witches and magic involving weather, for good or for ill. So what was a witch in the context of the sagas? The term witch has a range of meanings in Old Icelandic. It's not just one word, but a series of concepts which may be translated as witchcraft. So very, very different from our modern idea of somebody who wears a pointy hat and rides a broomstick. A witch was often described as fjölkunnig, or fjölkunniger if she was male, meaning someone who knew a thing or two. I really like this definition. So how many were there? There seemed to be a total of 78. Lux Dyla Saga has 9, Eyrbyggja Saga has 6, and Boulder Saga has 6 as well. Were they always bad? Well, witches, whether male or female, they're not necessarily described as being sinister in any way. Approximately 1/3, 25, of the people noted as witches are not reported as using their powers. And some are described positively, such as Oddbjörg in Lux Saga. She is described as a gleðimaður, fróð og framsýn, a cheery, knowledgeable prophet. And in Fóstbræðra Saga, the saga of the Swan brothers, a woman named Grima is described thus. Grima was said to be knowledgeable regarding many things, and people spoke of her as a witch. As Christianity was new to the country and had not fully taken hold, many people considered it as an advantage that a person was skilled in magic. So, what was the status of these witches? The use of witchcraft does not seem to be confined to any one class or group of people. Of the 38 women who were labeled as witches, 10 are identified as widows or heads of households. So in other words, independent of a man. Thorgrima in the Saga of Hord and the people of Holm is said to be fjölkunnig mjög, but also rich and powerful, as an example. So male witches. So the social status of male witches was very variable too. Diri in the Saga of Havad of Ísafjörð was, as you read, mikil og sterkur, fjölkunnigur. But he was also a great chieftain. So in translation, he was powerful and strong, knew a thing or two, and was very knowledgeable and did much magic. Whoops. It's got a mind of its own. It must be the witches. So, how to do things with sorcery. The sagas describe two main aspects of sorcery, the ritual act and the magic spell. Whether magic could be created by such ritual acts and also by spoken spells or charms. Poetry in particular could be imbued with magic and hence was thought to be able to influence weather events through language. Some poets, particularly the kraftaskald, the power poet or magic poet, was believed to have greater powers than others. Sometimes both words and rituals were used together to create magic. And just to say, the composition of complex poetry has been elevated to a high art in Iceland. And from medieval times onwards, I think I've read the nice suggestion that in medieval times and earlier, Iceland's main export to Norway was poets. So stories abound of people who were able to compose intricate poems on the spot. There are a lot of stories about that. And the incentive was often the reward of a wee dram. And I was just talking to that about about that with Vidar Reinsen. So thanks to him there too. So there are many terms and concepts associated with the making of magic. And here we have some of them in the Icelandic. Galdur, Seithur, Gerningaveður, so on. I won't read them all. But quite a lot of different terms. And I'll talk about some of them. So magic spells cast through the act of speaking include chants and libels and insulting phrases. Fordæðuskapur, that, and this is interesting because this is a statement in the early law book, Graugaus, that is fordæðuskapur, when a man by his words inflicts sickness or kills, whether sheep or humans. Gerningaveður, the making of dangerous weather through witchcraft, is termed in the sagas Gerningaveður, literally performative weather or weather acts. Sorry. So concepts such as fróðleikur, knowledge, lore, and markunnindi, having many skills, refers specifically to the power of the witch. The terms fyrinska and forneska have the sense of old heathen time and old law. Sjónhverfingur, another term, refers to both sight and sound and means literally ocular delusion by spell. Galdur og Seithur, in the many references to magic in the Sagas of Icelanders and other related literature, the relevant concepts are Galdur and Seithur. Both words may be translated just as magic, but they have rather subtly different meanings. Galdur refers to quite a sophisticated sort of magic. The word is associated with the verb gala, meaning to sing. Seithur, associated with the verb seitha, means to attract, and it refers to more mundane magic. So what are the origins of some of these things? Origins of Galdur, and I say lost in the mists of time, but connections may be found in Norse mythology, in particular with the gods Freyja and Odin. Odin was the god of both of magic and poetry, and in Hávamál it was said that he knew 18 different spells. I know a ninth one if I am in need, if I must protect my ship at sea, the wind I can lull upon the wave and quieten all the sea to sleep. That's a useful one, and this is coming up in English. Another useful one, and this is interesting for us. I know a 10th one if I see witches playing up in the air. I can bring it about that they can't make their way back to their own shapes, to their spirits. So, frequently the sagas describe the conjuring up of foul weather, such as wild storms, bloody rain, extreme cold, in order to negatively impact an enemy. But witches' storms could sometimes be ameliorated by counterspells, and occasionally weather magic could be used to improve the weather conditions. I'm going to give some examples from these specific sagas. I've had a longer list in my abstract, but I realized that time was a factor here. So these are the main ones that I'm going to refer to. So Eyrbyggja Saga, the saga of the people of Eyri, it covers the 9th century to 1031. It was probably written in the mid-13th century. The saga involves disputes and dealings among a number of chieftains and farmers on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in West Iceland. It tells of supernatural happenings and hauntings, particularly at a farm called Fróða. And this is a quotation here at the first sentence there from Björnstein Olason. He says of Eyrbyggja Saga, magic and sorcery are another supernatural element that not only spices up the action, but also affects the course of events. And the witches include the sexually attractive Katla of Holt and the somewhat older Geirrid of Mauvalith, who is knowledgeable about magic. Katla's black magic initiates a feud, but she's dealt with by the more benign witch, Geirrid. And we have Thorgrimr Magic Cheek, who's one of my favorites. And here we have a nice quotation. That winter, Thorod paid Thorgrimr Magic Cheek to bring out a wild storm while Björn was crossing the heath. One day, Björn went over to Frotha, but when he left to go home that evening, the sky was overcast and it had started to rain, and he was rather late getting going. By the time he came up to the heath, the weather had turned very cold and there were snowdrifts. It was so dark that he could not see the path in front of him. After that, a blizzard blew up with so much force that he could hardly stand up. Well, he survives. He recounts his experience in poetry, and this is just one verse from that poem. I've trodden the heathland, lost as a bewildered hound, unsure of my footing on the wide ways in the woman's wet magic snowdrift. Some witches are non-Icelandic. In Lux Dyla, for example, it's said of Kokkel and his family that they were from the Hebrides. And in Eyrbyggja Saga, it's stated, in the summer when Christianity was adopted by law in Iceland, a ship landed at Snæfellsnes. It had come from Dublin and had Irish and Hebridean men on board, as well as a few Norwegians. There was a Hebridean woman called Thorgunna on the ship. Well, there's something strange about Thorgunna. We read the crew of the ship said that she had brought finery with her that was very hard to get in Iceland. When Thurid, the mistress of the house at Frotha, heard this, she was very curious to see the finery, since she was fond of fine things and given to showy display. Well, the story continues with attempts by Thurid to buy Thorgunna's finery, a description of Thorgunna, and mention of Thorgrimr Magic Cheek, our old friend, who was also at Frotha, and the fact that she did not get on well with Thorgunna. Then the account shifts to haymaking. The cloud quickly scudded across the sky, and when it was over the farm at Frotha, it grew so dark that people could not see beyond the home meadow, and they could scarcely distinguish their own hands. So much rain fell from the cloud that all the hay lying on the ground became soaked. The cloud suddenly drew past and the weather cleared up. People could then see that blood had rained down in the shower. Creepy. But in the evening, there were good drying conditions, and the blood quickly dried out of all the hay except that which Thorgunna was drying. Thorod asked what Thorgunna thought this marvel might mean. She said she did not know, but it seems most likely to mean that it is a foreboding of doom for someone who is here. So I think this example, it's one of those where the element of the witches and the magic and the weather, it's really furthering the saga narrative. So Thorgunna dies, but before she does, she gives instructions to the farmer Thorod. She asks that her body be taken to Skalholt, because something tells me that place will one day be the most venerated in Iceland. And of course, that's interesting because the bishopric, the first bishopric, was established in Iceland in 1056. A gold ring she has must go to the church. Thurid is to be given her scarlet cloak, and so on. But her bed and bedclothes must be burnt. This does not happen. Thorgunna reappears as a ghost, and the serious hauntings at Frotha begin. If you're familiar with the saga, you'll know that the hauntings are very serious. They go on and on. Lots of people die. Horrible things happen. And finally, the power of the church is brought in, and various legal ceremonies, and then everything is fixed. But I guess the moral is when a witch, and Thorgunna must have been a witch really, but it would be nice to know more about her because she's so mysterious. But the moral is, heed the words, because she had said that her bed and bedclothes and everything must be burnt, and they weren't, because Thurid really wanted to have them for herself. Anyway, moving on to Niall Saga, which covers events from about 960 to 1020, and it was written late in the 13th century. It's often considered the best of the sagas. It certainly has a very complex plot. It's got memorable characters and brilliant writing. It doesn't have a supernatural background like Eyrbyggja Saga, but it does have some weather magic. There was a wizard named Svanur who lived in the West Fjords region of Iceland. He was the uncle of Hallgerd, who's one of the main female characters in the saga. She's often able to get him to do some of her dirty work. Now, she had incited a man named Thjostolf to kill her first husband, Thorvald. When men went to try to pursue him, Svanur created a magic fog to confound them in Icelandic. And here we are. Svanur took a goat skin and swung it around his head, chanting, "Let there be fog and let there be phantoms, weird marvels to baffle your hunters." Meanwhile, Osvif and his men were riding over the hill when a thick bank of fog advanced to meet them. A little later, a great darkness descended on them, blinding them. They fell off their horses and lost them. Some of the men strayed into swamps. All were in danger of injury and lost their weapons. Then Osvif said, "If I could find my horses and weapons, I would turn back home." As soon as he had said this, their sight returned a little and they found their horses and weapons. So they resumed the attack. But at once the uncanny events overtook them. And this happened 3 times before Osvif finally gives up. Moving on to Lux Dyla Saga. This covers the late 9th to the early 11th century, and it was written probably 1230 to 1260. Much of the action takes place in the Dalid district in West Iceland and involves the settlers of the Laxadar Valley and their descendants. It's most memorable for the love triangle between the main characters of Kjartan, Bolli, and Gudrun. So, Kotkell was the name of a man who had recently come to Iceland, another one from the Hebrides, as mentioned. His wife was called Grima, and their sons were Halbjörn, Sleekstone-Eye, and Stigandi. They were from the Hebrides. They were all skilled in magic and accomplished magicians. Chief Halstein received them and settled them at Urðir in Skalmafjord, where their presence was not popular. So a man named Thord, the second husband of Gudrun, accuses Kotkell and his wife and sons of sorcery. In revenge, Kotkell prepared a high platform for sorcery, which they all mounted. Then they chanted powerful incantations. They were sorcery. A great blizzard came up. Thord Ingunnason and his companions at sea felt how the force of the weather was directed at them and steered the ship west beyond the headland. Thord struggled valiantly aboard the ship. People on shore saw him throw everything overboard that could weigh the ship down. They expected that the ship would be able to make land after that. But all of a sudden, a break arose where no one could recall seeing a skerry and rammed the ship so that it capsized at once. Thord and all his companions were drowned, and the ship smashed into small pieces, the keel washing ashore on an island, which has since been called Keel Island. Thord's shield drifted ashore on an island called Skeldarey Shield Island. His body and the bodies of his companions drifted ashore immediately and are buried in a mound at Haugsness, Mound Point. Gisli Sørsson's saga. After beginning in Norway, the saga mainly takes place in the West Fjords region of Iceland. The main character, Gisli, may be described as a tragic hero. We've noted that one form of witchcraft involves a ritual act. This saga provides an example of this. The witch in question is named Eithbjörg, but she's only avenging her son. She walked several times with the shins around the outside of the house, sniffing in all directions. As she did this, the weather broke and a heavy blustering snowstorm started up. This was followed by a thaw in which a flood of water gushed down the hillside and sent an avalanche of snow crashing into Berg's farmhouse. It killed 12 men. The traces of the landslide can be seen to this day. And the saga of the people of Vasdal. The saga has colourful characters and vivid incident in good measure. Viking expeditions, sea battles, ancestral swords, pagan temples, witches and wizards, monstrous cats, and berserk trances. And another example from there of a ritual act. Ulfhedin was a great friend of jeweler study, and men say that when Thoradin the Evil challenged study to a duel, Ulfhedin accompanied him to the dueling place, and on that journey, the weather turned foul, and they believed it was a witch's storm. And another, there was a man called Bard who was called the Peevish. He also went with them. They asked him to call off the bad weather because he had the wisdom of a wizard. He asked them to join hands and make a circle. He then went round backwards 3 times, spoke in Irish, and bade them all say yes out loud, and this they did. He then waved a kerchief at the mountain and the weather relented. So here we have an example of the wizard helping or negating the bad weather magic. So there's some really wonderful examples of magic in the saga of Eric the Red, particularly with regard to the so-called Vadloker, the songs to call the spirits. The incident refers to a lean time. This incident we're going to just look at. A lean time in Greenland. Those who had gone hunting had had poor catches and some had failed to return. So, Thorbjörg. In the district, there lived a woman named Thorbjörg, a seeress who was called the Little Prophetess. She was one of 10 sisters, all of whom had the gift of prophecy, but she was the only one of them still left alive. And there's this fantastic description of her appearance. I won't read it all because you can read it yourselves, but I'll start. She was wearing a black mantle with a strap, which was adorned with precious stones right down to the hem. About her neck, she wore a string of glass beads, and on her head, a hood of black lambskin lined with white catskin. She bore a staff with a knob at the top. She had a link charm belt with a large purse. She wore calfskin boots lined with fur, and on her hands, she wore gloves of catskin, white and lined with fur. But she does the chant with the aid of, oh gosh, I've just had a mental block. Who's the woman? Gudrid. And the magic works. Thorbjörg states that the dearth will not last longer than this winter and that the season will improve as spring comes. As she has predicted, the weather improves. Well, I said that I would also think a little bit about the use of weather as metaphor and as a literary device. So here's this sentence from Gisli Saga. It was the kind of weather when the air was very still, but there was a heavy frost. And this sentence mirrors events in the saga, suggesting that things appear quiet on the surface, but that trouble will soon occur, as it does. Gisli is set upon by his enemies and loses his life. So this heavy frost, it also foreshadows the chill of death. And another example from the Saga of the Sworn Brothers. This saga focuses on the adventures of the brothers, the Sworn brothers, Thorgeir and Thormod, the love affairs of Thormod, and Thormod's revenge for Thorgeir's death. And the passage quoted below follows on from Thormod reciting a praise poem for the woman Thordis. It says, like the dark mists that are drawn up out of the ocean, dispersing slowly to sunshine and gentle weather, so did these verses draw all reserve and darkness from Thordis' mind, and Thormod was once again bathed in all the brightness of her warm and gentle love. So this passage, it likens the dark thoughts of the mind to dark mists that are drawn up out of the ocean, and the brightness of her warm and gentle love to sunshine and gentle weather. And I think it could be said that this statement, in just a few words, it powerfully evokes the intermingled joys and sorrows of human relationships. So moving on to local environmental knowledge, because I have a theory that some of what we're seeing in the sagas, the weather descriptions, the magic, the literary devices, but also there's a sense that some people have knowledge of what the weather is going to be like. And I don't think this is entirely silly at all, because we know so well from our studies with indigenous people and work in the Arctic, the importance of local environmental knowledge. And I think it's not so long ago that ordinary people, particularly people who were farmers and fishermen and so on, that of course they would look at the sea and the sky, and they would be able to tell quite often what sort of weather was on its way. I remember talking to a fisherman in the Westman Islands years ago, and he said, well, you know, my father would just look at the sea and the sky, but, you know, now we listen to the weather forecast on the radio. But so I say here, in subsistence farming and fishing, the reliability of environmental knowledge and forecasting the weather was of critical importance. And this is underlined many times in saga texts. So going back to Eyrbyggja Saga, here is an interesting passage. I can't give you any advice other than what I do myself, replied Ulfar. I'm going to have the scythes brought out today and have as much grass as possible cut all through this week, because I think it might become rainy. But after that, my guess is that we will have good drying weather for the next fortnight. The weather is good, Ulfar said, and it will clear up during the day. Today you will cut hay in the home field, and we'll look after the hay we have up on the ridge tomorrow. The weather turned out just as he had said, and in the evening Ulfar sent men up to the ridge to check on their haystacks there. It turned out just as he had said, for it was often the case that he could predict the weather better than others. Then Thorolf went home and ordered his many farm workers to get to work at once on the meadows. The weather turned out exactly as Ulfar had said. And another description like this from the Saga of the Sworn Brothers. It had been a bright day with a good deal of sunshine, but as Thormod reached the booth, the weather began to thicken. Thormod looked up by turns at the sky and then down at the ground in front of him. Egil said, "What are you doing that for?" Thormod answered, "Because both the sky and the earth indicate that a great blow is imminent." Egil said, "And what does such a great blow usually mean?" Thormod replied, "Such blows always portend important tidings." As they were speaking, there was a great shower of rain, a downpour that no one had expected, so that they all ran to their booths. So maybe this is a little bit of a weather forecast, but it's also another example of the weather mirroring events in the sagas, as the character Thorgrim is dealt a death blow just after this, with the word blow for the weather and for his death blow mirroring each other. So just some closing thoughts then on the topic. With regard to the changing concepts of witches and magic. So clearly the pre-Christian concept of witchcraft in Iceland did have some positive connotations. We know that terms such as fróðleikur and markunnindi, having the sense of wisdom and much knowledge associated with witches, these were positive. And frequently the practitioners of witchcraft or sorcery, they're not accorded any kind of moral judgment. There's no specific comment regarding Svanr in Niall Saga, for example. But it is true, some are described as wicked or evil. An example is Kotkel and his family in Lux Dyla Saga. But others, like Thorbjörg in Eiríks Saga, are described as performing good and noble deeds. But early church leaders dismissed the view that witches could influence the weather and so on. And later works, such as the very influential so-called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, which was written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a German Catholic clergyman, this became the principal text outlining treatment of witches, and it had the effect of associating witchcraft with the devil. So the references to witches and witchcraft clearly play an important part in the Sagas of Icelanders. They may be seen as a literary convention of saga writing, a narrative technique to create tension. But sorcery also appears closely tied to the micropolitics of the community. Personal misfortune may be seen in the context of the malignancy of neighbors. A witch works some sorcery, someone is accused and finally punished. And as the participants in the events mobilize kinsmen and dependents for support, they're drawn into the large-scale framework of Commonwealth Iceland. When weather is involved as well as politics, the spell is potent indeed. So summing up a bit, I think we've seen that references to weather magic play an important part in the Sagas of Icelanders. Clearly the concept of witchcraft was much more complex than the present day. Weather metaphors were part of a narrative technique to create tension and illuminate the action. And interspersed, we have perhaps instances of accurate weather lore reflecting local knowledge. So here are some acknowledgements of good colleagues of mine. Gisli Pálsson, of course, Niels Einarsson, Trusty Jonsson, Karen Grimstad, my colleagues at the Stofnun Árna Magnússonar, and the photos are mine. All the quotations from the sagas are from the Sagas of Icelanders, edited by General Editor Vidar Reynsson. That was the simplest thing to do. I felt slightly bad not using Hermann's translations, and as Colleen said, I have to say they're often my go-to translations, but it was simplest just to take all the quotations from one place. So before I end, I'd like to also acknowledge a project, which is the project, Colleen did mention this. It's called Reflections of Change, the Natural World in Literary and Historical Sources from Iceland, circa AD 800 to 1800. And I think it's pretty obvious what this is about. We call it Ice Change for short. It's funded by Riksbanken's Jubileumsfond, the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's administered by the Sigtuna Foundation in Sweden. And I want to acknowledge this because a part of this project is my more recent work on the weather magic and so on. So I very much wanted to do that. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues in Ice Change, Stephen Hartman, Jon Hauker Ingemundason, Árni Daniel Juliusson, and Vidar Reynsson. And here we all are. This is the Ice Change team thinking about sagas and magic and having fun at Old Uppsala. So you can see what we all look like and what fun we have. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid. That was really interesting. So many different things to think about there. And we have a number of questions. So I will just make a start on those and hope that we have enough time to just bring in the fact that there is quite good archaeological corroboration or potential identification of Sather, which in the work that's been done by Neil Price, but we can take it from there if time permits. So I'm going to give you a few questions. So the first one comes from Jane McNally, who talks about the looking at the ground for signs of climatic events. And she mentions that in Ireland, when they see big black slugs, they're a sign of rain. I have to say that's definitely the situation in my garden too. But so whether that's magical or otherwise, I don't know. But they would have had an awareness of all things like that, I'm certain. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, first of all, you know, another debt of gratitude is absolutely to Neil Price. And his wonderful work that he's done. There are a few, I guess this is sort of the subject of phenology, you know, looking at signs in nature for changes in the environment. And of course, we don't have slugs in Iceland. But I'm trying to recall if there are examples, like, not exactly, I don't think, not exactly. But yeah, an interesting thought.
Okay, and a second question from Jane is that the word gulda is used in the north of Ireland to mean shout in a rough way. And she's now wondering if it's an Old Norse word that came in via Scottish settlers. I'm not really sure whether that's anything that you can answer, but I throw it out there.
Well, I think that's these words are so interesting, and clearly some of the Celtic and Gaelic words did get into Icelandic, and I think you know, sometimes words strike one as being particularly interesting, and I can't comment exactly on that, but it would make sense to me, particularly as magic does seem to have been associated quite a lot with, you know, people from the Hebrides and Ireland and so on. But a word that has struck me as being quite interesting, the word in Icelandic, spjalla, to speak, I don't know, but doesn't that sound like the word spell in English? Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's great. So we've pass on from the slugs. The next one then comes from Bill Stevens, wanting to know about your take on the interpretation of the Eyrarland statuette in the Iceland National Museum as being Thor the Windraiser. Any comments on that? Thor the Windraiser.
Yeah. Gosh, you know, I just can't for a minute remember the statue. Who is it? Who is the sculptor?
I don't know. I'm not particularly familiar with the piece myself, so I don't know.
No, so I'm sorry, I can't help there.
Okay. Well, what I suggest, Bill, is if you have an image that you send it to Astrid, and she'd be happy to revert to you on that.
Yes, thank you.
The next one is from Brenda Prihal, and she's talking about accounts of weather magic in the sagas of the Icelanders relating to other types of medieval Icelandic literature. So do the Eddas have similar accounts?
Well, yes. I mean, the Eddas are, you know, they are steeped in magic, as it were. And, you know, I did mention the connections with Odin and Hávamál and so on. But yes, I mean, that would be a whole study in itself.
Yeah. Okay, and her second question then is there any consistency in what is involved in weather magic, types of actions or objects?
Yes, I think there is consistency. I mentioned the different types of magic and you know, like the rituals, you know, we hear about, people often seem to, the witches and wizards, they stand on a platform or something, and the way the storms are raised, often it's just by words or something we don't really hear. The Varlokur in Eiríks Saga, that's unique. I don't think I know of any other example quite like that. So it's wonderful to have that.
Thank you for that. Can I just say, if anybody is listening to anything I'm saying, and I don't mind if you're not, but please don't send in any more questions now, because we are now really beyond time. But I'm just going to run through the ones that we have left. So this is from Andy. Are there stories of witches and weather magic distinctly, are these stories of witches and weather magic distinctly Icelandic, part of a wider medieval tradition throughout the Norse world, or do we just simply lack the non-Icelandic sources to know that? And I guess that ties in really with Niall's stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I think, you know, the stories aren't unique to Iceland. I mean, in that they're so descriptive, but we have similar stories in Scandinavian literature as well.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have increasing archaeological evidence in terms of objects in burials and so on, which are identified. So if anybody is interested in that, you should also try to follow up the work of Neil Price. And if you just Google it, you would be able to find that.
Yeah, it says on the cover of the Neil Price book, it says something about, you know, one of the blurbs says, you know, it's like a detective story, you can hardly put it down, and that's how I felt, you know, with his main book. Yeah,
he's an excellent writer, and his Viking Way volume is very well available. So a comment from Jonathan Herold. In your discussion of weather magic, the example of Queen Gunhild of Norway's magic against Egil Skallagrimsson came to his mind. She not only causes Egil to get restless and leave safety in Iceland, but also wrecks his ship in England. And this suggests that magic, or the works of powerful magic makers or users, might have considerable range beyond a given locality.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. And of course, you know, she also influences Thrútur in Niall Saga, you know.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, right, carry on.
Yeah, and also kind of related to that a little anyway is one from Rebecca Tyson. Are there particular types of magic associated with sea voyages in the sagas? And I suspect that's an enormous.
Yeah, it is enormous, and there are several. Yeah.
Yes, there are, is the answer to that then.
Yes.
Thank you. And then just the final one from John Baldwin. Storms and so-called ravens, Calf Sound, Isle of Man, damaged ships, men killed, Battle of Clontarf, treachery, death and disaster in Niall Saga from memory. Are these examples of magic and witchcraft?
You know, sometimes it's tricky to know because the references are quite oblique. And, you know, for example, with Thorgunna, in Eyrbyggja Saga, it's never actually said that she is a witch, but you know that is implied. So I think I think the answer is yes, there probably really was a bit of weather magic in these things.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. That brings us to an end for these questions, Astrid. As you can see, lots and lots of interest from people. It is indeed a very, very exciting part of the discipline, and you've given us all this wonderful information for which we're very, very grateful. And I personally am grateful to have had this chance to chat with you this afternoon, and for you to share your boundless energy in academia with the rest of us. So thank you so very much.